You're listening to the Kilcullen Diary podcasts, stories in sound from a village grown bigger. Hello, I'm Brian Byrne and this is Kilcullen Diary. This podcast is one of a series of my short stories. It was written some time after a visit to the Chateau Cloux in Amboise in the Loire region of France. The chateau is where the artist and inventor Leonardo da Vinci spent the last years of his life. Name of a lady. Damn. Salai pulled his finger up quickly and sucked at it. The sliver from the crusty vine was stuck well under his dirt-rough skin. He hated this work. He hated what it had done to his hands and to his body. To his life. It wasn't the way of living that he'd been used to. He ran his tongue along his finger to locate the offending fragment, caught the end between his teeth and pulled. He spat it away. He was getting good at this, but that didn't please him. He shouldn't have to be good at it. He stood up. It was an effort, his back locked from the constant stooping of the last couple of hours. He took off his straw hat, plucked a rag from the band and dabbed the sweat from his face. It was getting too hot to continue, he thought. Certainly it was for him. Battista, on the other hand, was likely to stay out in the worst of the sun, which could be a real killer in the middle of a Tuscany summer. But the other man was younger. Also, he had only been a decade out from being a peasant when they had been thrown from their good life. He, Salai, on the other hand, had been Leonardo's right-hand man for, well, it seemed forever. Except, as he now knew all too well, death stops forever in its tracks. He looked around the field, searching for his partner's hat bobbing through the vines. Salai was determined that the man would take his break. Not that he particularly cared so much for Battista, but he needed him to stay in good health, just as Battista needed the senior man to stay healthy for him. He was senior in age only, of course, which added to Salai's bad humour when he allowed himself to think about it. It just wasn't fair that they had been left equal partners in the vineyard. Bad enough that it was all that he, Salai, had gotten in Leonardo's will. After all he had done for the man over decades. Servant, model, muse, and more. He also resented Battista's enthusiasm for the shared legacy. The other had never been in line for property or wealth of his own. This miserable set of fields outside Pisa probably seemed like a kingdom to him, so he was always happy and optimistic for the outcome of the crop, no matter how hard it was earned. Salai had begun to daydream his way back to the Loire when he saw his partner's hat bob up about 10 rows of vines down the field. "Battista," he called gruffly, "time for lunch." When he got an answering wave, he made his way back to the small house on the edge of the field. Salai believed that a meal should be ready when those about to eat arrived. And although when with Leonardo he rarely prepared the food, he had overseen the work of Mathurine, the cook. So when Battista arrived some 20 minutes after him, Salai had their repast laid out. Cheese, slices of cured ham, water and wine. The wine was from the vineyard, though the first crop under their ownership had yet to be harvested. It was rough compared to that which Salai had enjoyed in France. The tenants who had worked the vineyard in its owner's absence had let it go badly. Battista came in, his face dripping from a wash in the water trough outside the door. He was short and broad. His physique suited the work of the vineyard. And he was very strong, one of the reasons Leonardo had taken the man into his employ before their tough trip over the Alps. Salai had known him for about 5 years, but they had never become friends, which wasn't necessary among servants. Even now, when they were no longer such, it wasn't necessary either. It was a pity that they were required to stay together. The lawyer had been very clear on this. You must produce 3 crops together before either of you can sell your interest. Your master was quite adamant. Salai would have liked to argue, but he knew it wouldn't do any good. Apart from the fact that it was Leonardo's expressed wish, one simply didn't argue with the lawyer of the King of France. Anything coming from him would have the gravity of a pronouncement from the king himself. Besides, he was somewhat in shock, both over the death of Leonardo, albeit it had been expected for some months, and from the details of the great man's will. He'd known that he wouldn't be forgotten. They'd been through too much together for that. And that Francesco Melzi, the master's longtime student, should also benefit wasn't unexpected. But Melzi, a gentleman of means already, had been left virtually all of Leonardo's possessions. To Salai that seemed downright unfair. Mathurine, the cook, had received a little money and the master's fine coat, which seemed about right. In truth, giving Salai part ownership of the vineyard back in Tuscany was no mean legacy of itself, but that he should have to share it with the new servant, Battista, was unexpected, and, as far as Salai was concerned, not a welcome development. So, any questions? Lawyer Burroughs' tone indicated that he didn't really want any, and that he felt he had given the minor beneficiaries enough of his expensive time. Melzi had been in the previous day, and Salai suspected that he had been given a much warmer welcome, and probably all the time he wanted. Mathurine sat in a corner seat in the office, red-eyed, and occasionally breaking into quiet sniffles. Battista stood by her, a big hand on her shoulder. Neither seemed inclined to talk. Just one, on my account anyhow, Salai eventually said. How do we get the permission to go our separate ways? He paused, and then added politically, if that is what we want to do. Burrough nodded. A good question, but simply answered. Your master made the conditions himself, that you should send to me a consignment of each year's wine, with a letter signed by both of you. Upon receipt of the 3rd one, my office will issue the full title to the property, and your permissions to do what you will with your portions. In the meantime, you both hold the property under a provisional title. The lawyer tapped at an envelope in front of him, wax sealed. This letter will allow you, in the meantime, to live on, work, and enjoy the profits of the vineyard. Salai saw a complication. What if something happens to one of us during the 3 years? Perhaps an illness, even death. Burroughs smiled, without humour. That too was foreseen. In the case of illness, the well person shall look after the other and also tend the vineyard. If one of you dies, however, and he paused for a little drama, then the vineyard reverts to the majority of the estate. Salai could hardly believe it. You mean... The lawyer nodded, the set of his thin lips hinting that he was enjoying himself. In such an instance, it would revert to the ownership of Monsieur Melzi. Battista had taken it much better. As well he might have, given his lesser expectations anyhow. Half a vineyard in his nose was something not to be sneezed at. As for sharing with Salai, well, he didn't really see any problem there. He was grateful to the late Leonardo, very grateful. It had taken the Italian party several weeks to complete the move out of Chateau Cloux. For Salai, it was a peculiar time. While he had moved many times with his late master, Their 3 years at the small manor house in Amboise had been rather different. The great man considered his use of the dwelling, a gift from Francois I, to be the first decent home that he could call his own. He could work, he could entertain, he could pray in the house's own private chapel when he wanted to. He had extraordinary access to the king, who actually came to visit most days, using a tunnel linking his larger chateau with the home originally built for the monarch's mother. Leonardo was also first painter, architect, and engineer to the king. It was also the place, and for a so short period, where Salai himself felt part of a royal court. Even if he was only a servant in a relatively tiny Italianate part of it. But because his master was so well considered by their hosts, Salai's position gained its own level of power in a direct reflection from that of Leonardo's. It had been evident in a number of pleasing ways. When, for instance, the king's servant would check with Salai to see if the great man was available for a chat. A my man, your man kind of thing. And the times when somebody wanted an audience with Leonardo, a favour from the king's favourite, perhaps. They would check out the ground initially through Salai, the man who had the ear of his master. There were gifts from time to time, of course, never asked for but part of the ritual. A discreet part, always issued through a third party because that was the arm's length way such business was done. Salai had acquired clothes, accessories, credit in favoured restaurants through the system. But the presents were as nothing when compared with the sense of importance, of power. It was these latter that he truly missed the most in this stage of his life. "It's going to be a good one, eh?" Salai woke with a start from a reverie over the last of their food. What was that? My mind was on other things. Battista grinned, his yellowed teeth an affront to Salai's sensibilities. "Yeah, you were in the old days again, right?" "Okay, but they're gone, Sal. You might as well get used to it." He broke another piece of bread and stuffed it in his mouth, began talking again immediately, if somewhat less distinctly. "I said, it's going to be a good harvest. Those grapes are filling out nicely. We'll have a good crop." Battista, it had turned out, had a good peasant's knowledge of growing things, and though there wasn't any history of serious viniculture in his family, Salai had to admit that he seemed to know his stuff. "Yes," he acknowledged. "The first one towards our full ownership, eh? A good one will at least please the lawyer." It was a backward compliment to Battista's work, but that was as much as Salai wanted to go. No point in giving his younger partner ideas above his place. Battista lifted a slice of ham with his fingers and tore a mouthful with his teeth. He munched noisily. "We'll have a profit too, money to spend, even after we put aside some for next year's work." He spat a piece of gristle back onto his plate, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "What'll you do with your share, Sal?" Salai cut into his meat with his knife, and then transferred it to his mouth with his fork, the gentleman's way he had learned from an early age. Battista must also have been shown such manners because he hadn't disgraced himself while in Leonardo's employ, but he had reverted very much to peasant ways since coming back to Tuscany. Sometimes Salai wasn't sure if he'd be able to stick living and working with the man on a daily basis for the next 3 years. He'd have to be careful that he didn't lose it and kill him in a temper. "Hey, Sal, so what do you plan to do?" The older man shrugged. "Haven't given it any thought. What about you?" He didn't really want to know, but he figured the question might deflect the other's curiosity. "My father and mother are old," Battista mumbled through another chunk of bread. "Poor, too. I'll send them some. Put the rest aside, probably for my own old age." he distracted himself with a bit of cheese. When he'd speared a piece and knifed it into where the ham and the bread had disappeared earlier, he came back to the conversation with the thought, "You could buy a frame for the woman." Salai abruptly got up. He gathered his own plate and utensils and went outside to rinse them in the trough. He stacked them on a shelf to dry in the sun, and then went to his room to escape the heat for an hour, and to remove himself from any further comments by his colleague. In the relative cool, he reached into a chest and pulled out a scuffed leather satchel. He sat on his bed and unlaced the end flap, slid out its contents. It was only the third or fourth time he had done this since they had come to the vineyard. He spent the rest of his midday break lost in the past, the part in Florence. She wasn't an obvious beauty, but Leonardo had always been interested more in the inner characteristics of his models than their exterior shapes and colours. So Salai wasn't particularly surprised to find his master doing preliminary sketches of a fairly ordinary woman who had come to his studio. He didn't know her background, but her demeanour and dress suggested her to be fairly decent class. She said nothing of her own volition, only answering to the few questions and directions of Leonardo during the sittings. Salai knew that it was a commission, not one of the master's own studies. "Francesco del Giocondo's wife," Leonardo muttered one day while fiddling with one of the drawings. "He wants me to show what he sees, but I'm damned if I can find it. She's a nice enough woman, his Lisa, but why does he think of her as his mistress in marriage?" Salai had seen it instantly when the woman had glanced at him briefly as he entered during an early sitting. But he didn't comment. He may have been close to the master, but he knew his place. He didn't even allow himself to dwell on why Leonardo might not be able to see the mistress potential in the woman. His genius as an artist was undeniable, but in all the time that Salai had been his assistant, he had never known the master to take a personal interest in the many beautiful women he had immortalized to canvas. Indeed, he knew, but a faithful servant, he let that thought die. "Sal, hey guy, I need you to help me in the top field. Come on, wake up, man." Salai came out of his dreams with a start. "Right," he called through the door. "I'll be out in a few minutes. Go ahead, I'll follow you." What the other said was incomprehensible, but the tone indicated that he had heard. Salai laced up the satchel again. He put it away in the chest, covered in a wool blanket. He left the room with a sigh. Battista had talked about clearing the rocks in the top field to extend the planted part of the property. Salai had hoped the other had forgotten about it, but now he knew to the contrary. It was going to be a tough afternoon. And it was. Both of them worked on the lifting of the rocks. Battista, because he was the bigger and stronger, wheeled the cart in which they gathered them, to later use for building walls or to sell for building by others. Though the sun was now in its decline for the day, the heat which it had fed to the land continued to sap the energy of the pair. Eventually, Salai called it. "Enough," he said to his companion. "There are other days." Battista was dripping as much sweat as Salai, though not showing as much energy depletion. He shrugged. "Okay, we've done good so far anyhow. No point in overdoing it." "We already have," Salai thought, but glad to have the other's agreement to the end of work for the day, he let the thought go. Salai's dreams that night were vivid and recollective. They involved the preparations for the journey from Italy to France. 3 paintings not finished, Leonardo grumbled. Too much other stuff, the army requirements, the castle designs, not to mention the events. Although his original fame had come to him because of his art, Leonardo's hyper-inquisitive mind had propelled him in many other directions. Even for him, time for work was finite, and the spread of his skills extended demand for them almost geometrically. His military work, developing or improving weapons and fortifications, paid his not unimpressive bills, but also took up most of his time. And the inventiveness which he had shown in organizing technically artistic showcase events for Italian noblemen also took increasing demands on time, which was becoming ever more precious as he grew older. He had decided that he should provide the remainder of his time to one man, who had repeatedly offered him everything he needed if he would accept his invitation to live in the heartland of France's royalty. "Load the unfinished ones in the saddlebags," he told Salai. "I will have opportunity to finish them in Amboise." The dream compressed itself then through the long and arduous trip on horseback with pack mules across the Alps to France. Salai woke up before the good times were properly in place. It was going to be another tough day, he remembered. He also realized, painfully, that his muscles hadn't yet recovered from the previous one. "You know, I mean it. You should frame her." Breaking fast in the vineyard wasn't anything special. Bread, milk from the goats hobbled in the backyard. It was done early before the sun had broken through the false dawn, giving those who worked in the open a chance to get started without being immediately baked. Battista's comment was muffled, punctuated with crumbs. At this point in breakfast, it wasn't easy for Salai to ignore it. "Why?" he asked, trapped and early morning grumpy. Battista, for once, managed to swallow the masticated bread before he continued. Maybe he had had to think about the answer. "Well, because she has something." "What something?" the other asked, his tone testy, not going to give away the fact that he knew it to be true. Battista just shrugged, said nothing more, seemed to lose interest. Melzi had been Leonardo's most consistent student, at least for as long as Salai had been in the service of his master. There had been others coming and going through the years, but only Melzi had made the journey across the Alps with the rest of the small Italian entourage. In the Chateau Cloux, Leonardo did his best to complete the 3 paintings which they had brought from Italy. But no more than had been the case back in his home country, he was kept very busy by his host, Francois I. Designs for a new chateau, staging grand parties, the almost daily chats which the king seemed to enjoy so much. So it was Melzi who spent most time on painting and drawing during their sojourn in the Loire. Like his teacher, he favoured the light in the lower rooms of the house set into the hill above a green parkland. "I need more brushes, Salai," Melzi said to the servant one day after the man had answered the room's bell. "Sir," Salai nodded. "While I am in the city, is there anything else?" He noticed that Melzi was using Leonardo's painting of Lisa del Giocondo as the basis for a similar portrait of a lady. "Yes, now that you ask. I need some paper for sketches." The artist put down the brush and painted board he had been using and walked to a desk in the corner of the room. He rummaged around, found a small bag amid the scatter of letters, drawings and books. He extracted a coin. "Here, this should be enough." Although all of the master's living and work expenses were more than amply covered by the pension from the king, Melzi came from a wealthy family of Italian nobles and was a stickler for paying his own way. Salai took the coin. He was a little distracted, comparing the 2 pictures while he had waited. He had gained some competence in art simply by his long association with Leonardo, and he had also been a pupil artist for a time in the early course of their association. He was struck by how more detail there was in Melzi's copy. It was also very technically skillful and correct, but it wasn't quite right, he thought. "I won't be long, sir," he said, backing towards the door to the required distance before turning his back to Melzi and quitting the room. As he left the house, he realized something else. Melzi's woman was actually somebody else, not Leonardo's Lisa. He had also seen that the master had finally managed to find and show what it was about Lisa that had made her a mistress even to her husband. 2 months later, all the matters with the lawyer completed, Salai and Battista were ready to begin their journey to their legacy in Tuscany. The night before, Salai heard the summons of the studio bell again. It was now an eerie sound with the master so recently gone. Although technically no longer in anyone's employ, habit brought him down to the room. He found Melzi there. The student was staying on in the Amboise court, having received an invitation from the king. One of the paintings was still on its stand. It was that of Lisa. "Salai, I thought you might like to have something of the master's," Leonardo's former student said. "I'm finished with this, as my own portrait is complete. Would you like to take it with you?" Salai was more than surprised. His relationship with Melzi had never been more than the distance between nobles and servants, and certainly never close like his one with Leonardo. On top of that, he hadn't quite concealed his irritation over the master's student getting virtually all of Leonardo's legacy. "Sir, I thank thee," was all he could manage. Melzi shook his head dismissively. "It's nothing. I'm finished with it. The king has bought my painting to keep at court, at a very good price, I might add. I'd be happy if you could take this one away." Well, 1 year gone. Battista was in good form, as indeed was Salai. They had completed their first harvest, the grapes had been pressed and the wine made. The required consignment was already on its way to the lawyer, and they had profits. Yes, a year, Salai felt curiously content. The year had done more than make the pair of them money. Unexpectedly for him, his feelings about his partner had improved, as they had about the vineyard itself. When he thought about it, he wondered if the master had planned this all along, to give him a final independence from being a servant. With equality, there was, he had discovered, a responsibility for tolerance. He nodded to Battista, and then went to his own room. He had the woman on the wall now, the frame a small gift from his partner when they had been paid for their wine. Who knows, he thought. She and he might stay here for the rest of our days. He'd had the best of the deal, he figured. Melzi's painting might be in a place where more people could see it, but he had what he had seen in the master's studio all those years before, and what Leonardo had finally brought out. Melzi had named his painting something quite generic, Noblewoman of Florence, or something like that. Salai smiled across at the woman in Leonardo's work. For him, she needed no name, but he had given her one anyhow. Madonna Lisa. From his wall, she seemed to flirt with his soul. I'm Brian Byrne. This is Kilcullen Diary. Thank you for listening.